this episode, I talked to Gary Hawke, who's based in London, and we talked about bodybuilding, yoga, running, long distance running, that is, love as the essence of spirituality, integral theory, the good things about integral theory and some of the limitations, critical realism and the work of Roy Bashkar, drama therapy as a means of shadow work and working with our emotions, and Gary's own journey with psychotherapy, and then his transition into being a psychotherapist and working with clients, and what that journey was like. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Gary Hawke. Very nice to see you, and very generous of you to come and share your personal story with us about your life of practice. And you are so I've been working with you as your client, psychotherapy client, for a long time. Probably 2008 we started.
It's quite a long while.
Yeah. And we do, well, mainly we've been working via Skype once a month, but we've also done some workshops together where you've come down and facilitated workshops for weekend or something, and we've got lots of people in to do that, which have been really deep. So we've got a relationship that goes back quite a long way. But what's going to be nice for me today is to learn more about your story of practice, because normally, as one would expect, when we're doing a psychotherapy session, it's all about me. So, so I was thinking maybe, with the difference to some of the other calls I've done that have been kind of an organic narrative, and all of this stuff's been woven into it, we might try starting with the individual of these four fundamental domains of body, heart, mind, and spirit, and maybe just doing them one at a time. We'll see how that unfolds. Okay. So if we start with body practices, and I know this is a very large part of your practice at the moment, body related practices, and I'd love to hear your kind of history with body-based practices, how they started and how it's evolved over time.
So I can go right back to being about 18, 19 really, and I was quite skinny and I could never really put weight on, and I started, it must be about 20, I started bodybuilding, and I really noticed how through bodybuilding I began to expand myself. I basically began to put weight on, but there was also something about feeling much more at ease with myself. And then I think, and I got very much involved in bodybuilding for about 5 or 6 years. So mostly through my early 20s up to being about 26 or 27. And then I had quite a bad injury. I tore the buttock off my hip doing squat. I got into this mad idea of seeing if I could squat 400 pounds. And I'd really, and for a long while, I think I kind of rejected my body. In that it suddenly struck me that I had this thing that I could really work with, that was really giving me sort of sense of expansion of myself. I had these exercises, the dedicative practice to doing those, the health and nutrition around all of that, and it really became something very important to me. Then all of a sudden it went, and I just couldn't. For a long while I couldn't walk, couldn't move, and I think I just sort of went, yeah, I'm not going to do that anymore. So it was a complete rejection of the body. And it wasn't really until I started training as an actor that I began to see the body as a vehicle of intentionality. And I think primarily because there's a thing that Peter Brook in Poor Theatre talks about, the idea of making the invisible visible. And I became incredibly interested in sort of people like Grotowski. Grotowski has this idea called the plastiques. Grotowski was a Polish theatre director, and he was really interested in how the actor uses their body to communicate. So my body went from being something that was sort of muscle bound and quite fixed and quite egoic and pushing, to a thing that I could use to communicate my inner sense. And I became fascinated by Grotowski and his ideas of movement. The idea that you could work with the body and the emotions to create a communicative sense of who you were. And from that, I started seeing myself as a physical theatre actor. So
just before we develop that line of narrative further, I just want to pick up on one point. An injury is quite a rite of passage for somebody doing work with their body, particularly if it's a kind of athletic pursuit like bodybuilding. It's a very difficult thing to happen to somebody who loves working with their body, and they're very fit and they're used to doing a lot of that, on a day-to-day basis. Could you speak a bit about how that injury changed the way? Well, I mean, what kind of impact did that have on you? And did you learn some lessons from it? And
well, it's interesting because when you were speaking there, it suddenly struck me that at that younger age, it wasn't really the body that was the issue. It was actually my ego being encapsulated in the body. So it was more about what I could do with the body from an egoic perspective. So the idea of, shredding the fat and having the muscles, it was very much about showing the body off. So when I had the accident, what I realised now is that I didn't have a relationship to the body. I just ignored the body. It just went out of the window. So I think there's something about holding the body as an aspect of yourself that's, in a sense, not part of the ego. So the reason I'm suggesting that is because I've had many injuries. In drama school, I slipped a disc. I didn't stop. At that point, slipping a disc was just, that's what happens when you're working with the body. Because I'd begun to see the body as something that was primarily important to be with. Originally, the first injury, it was very much about, you let me down, body. It's your fault, this. And a lot of that, the health things went, the nutritional things, it all got rejected. It's like the body got just rejected because I'm injured. Well, it's your fault, body, that you did that to me. Whereas when I've had injuries now, it's been a process of being with the body and healing the body, because being with the body becomes very important to me now. If I don't have a fit body, if I don't have a body that I can commune with, then I can't commune with anybody else. When I was 18, I didn't see that. Now I see it as a really important thing. And I think that's the important thing, is that an injury is something that means you can sort of take a step back and reassess what you're doing. But it's in the process. And if one doesn't get egoically connected to the body in that respect, it's just part of the process.
I think you've highlighted a really good transition in a practice, a body-based practice, where it's quite common for people to go from their body is kind of like almost like some kind of pack animal. It makes me think of these sort of donkeys that you see in Greece taking fat tourists up these mountain paths and stuff, and they look so emaciated and physically just beaten in, and and you're not in a relationship with your body, a loving relationship. It's like if you could flip the tables, and it was like you're in a relationship with somebody that treated the way you treat your body in this scenario, you'd be so unhappy. So I think there comes a point where you kind of fall in love with your body. Was I breaking up a bit there?
No, you're fine.
Oh,
no, you're
okay.
absolutely right. And I think that's the thing. I think when I started seeing the body as a vehicle of communication, then it became something, an issue that was important to me. So therefore, let's make sure that I have the communicative abilities in the body. So the dancing is a good thing, or some of the other work that I've done in investigating drama, all those activities were all about letting the body speak from itself. So therefore, now I have to think about, what do I need to do with my body to ensure that it's in its optimum condition, yet at the same time recognize that as I'm getting older, I'm more susceptible to injury. But it's just part of being in relationships, and sometimes sometimes relationships are not good, sometimes they are good, but it's still the relationship there. Whereas prior to that, there was no relationship.
Yeah.
So that when I hurt myself, I recall going back to the gym and wandering around, and went to pick a weight up and realized that I couldn't pick the weight up of the weight that I picked up before the injury, and I kind of, no, I don't want to do it anymore. And that's the egoic thing.
Yeah. So we're now, you're at drama school.
Drama school, and at drama school, of course, it's drama school, so you're doing lots of different activities. And from a physical perspective, it's dance. I did all the jazz dance and contemporary dance, and I'm building up this notion of what it means to be an actor that's physical. So I'm becoming really interested in things like Grotowski's work, and I'm becoming interested in Peter Brook's work, and I'm becoming interested in Stephen Burkhoff's work, which are all the sort of theatre producers who are thinking about the body as a communicative thing. I start becoming really interested in yoga. And I think I practiced yoga. I sort of practiced hatha yoga, and primarily with sun salutations, with extensions. And I did that for, dear me, I did that for about 10 years. And because I have a bit of an addictive nature, so I did that almost every day for 10 years. And I think at that point, what I gained from yoga, so this is probably right through the 90s, really. I think when I sort of started becoming interested in yoga, it became being with the body in a subtle way.
Yeah.
Whereas prior to that, everything had been quite, it had been heavy work. The dancing was heavy work. Everything was sweaty. Everything was about pushing the body and really placing a lot of pressure and stress on the body. Whereas yoga suddenly became this thing where the body was this kind of subtle thing. And that really gave me a much more grounded sense in my relationship to my body is something that could be tender. Was prior to that, it's been very aggressive. And then, of course, then integral theory starts to emerge for me. And at that point, the body starts to become slightly different in a way. It's not just a physical thing, but it's kind of a thought-based thing as well. So there's a sort of, I become much more interested in diet. So it's not just exercise now. It's things like keeping the physical body healthy. Whereas bodybuilding is very much about, it's all about getting the proteins in. Whereas there was a shift, in a sense, to thinking about diet in a way that would able to maintain that subtle relaxation that yoga gave. And then integral theory, of course, starts to ask you to think about the body in slightly different ways. So the idea of subtle bodies and causal bodies and gross, all that kind of spiritual dimension. But prior to that, it had not really been there. It's not fair to say that I come from a family that was very religious. So the notion of spirituality runs through all that. But to think about the body as a spiritual vehicle really starts to emerge when I start into the early 2000s, really.
It's definitely not part of treating the body as sacred is definitely not part of the Christian mainstream tradition, as far as I've encountered it. You're saying about, you were coming from this religious upbringing.
I think from the Christian tradition, really, the body's very much been something that you eat. They talk, it's the body of Christ. What there isn't in, or my experience of the Christian tradition, is that the body was something that you had to get away from. To get to heaven, you have to leave the body in a sense, really. So there isn't very much. I mean, throughout my childhood, there wasn't very much about being in the body, apart from the fact that my father was very much into, when he was younger, he was also into bodybuilding. So there was a kind of parental connection there. But other than that, there wasn't really in that sort of tradition that my parents are following. It was more about ecstatic body. I remember going to a Pentecostal church meeting where people were sort of having, it appeared to me as a child that they were having fits. So there was an ecstatic movement, but it was very much about getting out of the body. It wasn't about being in the body. And I think it took me quite a while to get that sense of what the body is and how one is in the body. And then I have an issue. And my issue is, when we're with the body, what are we practicing? And I've always had that I always had an issue around the notion of practice. But for me, what I began to do is think about building a more deeper, long-term relationship with my body. So as opposed to getting out of my body, what I want to do is get into my body. And I really wanted to see what my body could do.
Yeah.
And so what integral theory brought forward, and also the George Leonard integral transformative practice did, is it began to talk about different ways, so that different ways in which you could work with the body. So the kata, the integral life practice has a kata, integral transformative practice has a kata, and it's just a series of movements. I think kata means dance, doesn't it, or flow? So the idea, there's a series of movements that you can practice, and you can bring multiple things into them. So I did that again. I looked at the kata and did the kata for many years, and also running integral life practice groups meant that we were doing the kata, and I was training people in doing the kata, and I really learned the kata and became very efficient in doing the kata. The muscle memory was so good that I could just do it anywhere.
Yeah.
And I think, but then I have the issue of starting to become slightly disillusioned with integral theory. But then the next thing that happened to me is that I suddenly realized that I was going to be 50. And what does that mean for somebody who's 50 and their body? And how does the relationship to the body change as we become older? But not just how does the relationship to the body change as we become older, but what's the mental space that we have about the body, and what's the social message we get about the body when we get to 50? And I, in myself, decided I wanted to challenge that. And so I did something I've never really done before, which is I started running. And I ran, and I've run marathons, I've run ultra marathons. What I wanted is, I wanted to really see what would happen to my body if I ran, but I took all the other things I'd done, the subtleness, the use of the weights, the use of the yoga. If I thought about bringing all those things to the running, could I sustain running when it would become much more challenging to avoid injury? And really, I mean, we're 7 years in now, and running has been my main physical practice. I went back to using weights because I wanted to sort of structure my muscles more. But what I found about running is that you could lock in the other practices, the other dimensions of an integral life practice. That you could create an integral life practice that was predominantly structured around running. So for me,
I remember you were telling me about Zen running.
Yeah, well, there's also the whole notion. I mean, there's Zen running, there's Chi running, the whole notion of mindfulness running. That again, I think it goes back to the notion of distancing ourselves from our egoic construct of who we are, and not seeing the body as something that we can do to show the world who we are. That sort of, look at my muscles, look how fast I can run, look at my personal best. This sort of valuing the body as something that I can hold up and say, aren't I a good person, or don't I do well? For me, it was suddenly saying, actually, running is a very deep spiritual practice of being at one with oneself, being completely in tune with the movement of oneself, being completely open to the environment. I run in London, so it's one has to constantly be surveying where we are. You know, the roads, the sort of risk assessment of running in London is something that has to be thought about. But it's a pure practice of being in nature with oneself. And it's the idea of the forward momentum of just noticing that when you drop into that space in yourself and you are completely calm and relaxed and your body's in motion, for me, it makes me feel alive.
Mm.
And really running has become, I would have to say, in some respects, running's become the only thing, from a practice perspective, it's the only thing I do. And that's primarily because I have a contraction. I have a contraction against the notion of practice. I think I struggle with the term. So for me, I'm not practicing anything. I'm just
Well,
being.
yeah, one of the things that I've talked with other people is how, as this kind of practice lifestyle matures over time, that to begin with, it does feel very much like you're doing practices, and it's a little bit like when you learn to drive a car. You get in, and there seems to be so many things you're having to take into account all the time, with gear changing, checking the mirrors and the clutch and all that, and everything seems sort of separate. But you know, as over time, you just get in your car and you just drive, and it's just an extension of who you are. And you know, when one's been doing certain practices for many years, it just becomes baked into your way of being. It's your lifestyle now, and it's not, you don't you wouldn't necessarily talk about it in terms of, oh, I have this practice and that practice. Yeah, does that make sense?
It does. The difficulty I have, I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying, but the difficulty I have is, for me, practice is getting better at something.
Yeah.
And this was my sort of one of the reasons why I sort of started to move away from integral life practice. I don't know what I'm practicing. I'm not practicing to play tennis. I'm not practicing for running a marathon. I'm just being, and I feel that there's a notion in the community that we are practicing. We're not practicing because you would have to say, well, what are you practicing for? What are you trying to get better at? And I think, for me, it's not about practicing to get better at something. It's actually practicing, if practice is a practice, it's about liberating myself from things that are holding me back.
Mm.
But I'm not practicing that.
That's uh I I tend so I people sometimes have in like an intrinsic motivation, and some people have an extrinsic motivation. People tend to fall into one of the two camps, and some people like to set themselves specific tasks and goals, and that's the more extrinsic thing. And the intrinsic motivation is more, you do it for the love of the act itself. And I feel like the sort of practices that I do them to with this unending expansion, is the kind of the driving force of my practice. And I don't necessarily have a goal I'm working towards. It's just I do it. Whereas more early on for me, it was I would sort of set up these goals, but I realized I was someone that preferred the intrinsic motivation approach rather than the extrinsic.
Yeah, I think, particularly with the body, and I've thought long about this, and I'm not sure if I'm motivated anymore. I think I just do it. It liberated me so much, that just that sort of notion of I can do the shadow stuff in the running, I can do the spiritual dimensions in the running, I can work through my relationships, I can think and process information, I can think about things, or I can unthink about things. the running just became what I do. And what I've noticed recently over the past year or so is that it's no longer intrinsic or extrinsic. It's just breathing for me. I just do it.
Mm.
And so, you know, I mean, I've said before, I've got I started doing cold showers a year ago, and I decided of doing a cold shower every day for 5 minutes. And I don't know, I think I've done about almost 300 cold showers. But one of the things I noticed with the cold showering is that I just do it. I don't do it. There's no intrinsic motivation. There's no extrinsic motivation. It's what I do. And I think that's what's been really beautiful for me, is that it's liberated me from the constraints of practice. I don't practice. I just do them.
Yeah. With that, I'm just thinking of somebody just starting out on some kind of practice journey, hearing you say this, and they might be saying, they might feel, oh, it's easy for Gary to say this because he's been, you know, doing this practice for um, 30 years or whatever, and he's got to the place where it doesn't feel like a practice anymore. You know, do you feel people can start from that place, or is it a place that one gets to?
Well, I'm not sure. Let me think through that. I trained as a British athletics running coach when I started running because I wanted to understand the mechanics of running. And when I did work with people to sort of help them start running. And one of the things that I used to say at the beginning is, what we're going to do is just run and see what happens. The important thing, I think, in practicing is to start with the feel of it. What does it feel like? Where does it land for you mentally? Where does it land in your body? When you, after the event and after the exercise or the practice, what are you left with? Really get a sense of, how does this feel in me? How does this sit in me? And in doing that, is it something that I want to pursue? Do I want to begin to dedicate myself to that? And that might be the intrinsic motivation.
I think it's when you love something, it you have this natural affinity for it, and you just want to do it because you love it. And that's quite what you're saying is making me think about that you can kind of, you can try out different practices to begin with, but and actually just feel like, what does it feel like to do it, and is there the possibility of falling in love with that particular thing, you know, over in long term.
Yeah, but I think it's a bit like building a relationship. The, what where I think I went wrong is that I didn't build a lasting relationship with something. I went out there and said, I want that as quickly as possible. So when I took up bodybuilding, it was very much about, I wanted to be 8 stone. I wanted to be 14 stone. So I worked really hard to get to being 14 stone. And of course, stupidly hurt myself in a sense. But I think what was happening is that there was no time for relationship. I didn't think about the thing I was doing. I just thought about the techniques. And I think in a way, as I begin to think about this more, I think that's where I began to see my understanding of practice slightly differently, is that in the practice of bodybuilding, I lost myself. There was no relationship. I didn't build a long-term relationship. I didn't think about what this was like when I was 70. I just did it because I wanted to do it. And now I found something that might have come from the fact that it's built on or it's underlaid by all the other things I've done. But I want to do it for as long as I can do it, physically do it. So now it's a relationship. So it's not just a relationship with the activity, it's a relationship with my body. And I'm starting to think about, well, how do I want to cultivate that relationship?
It's lots of people refer to whatever practices as like a marriage. it's entering into a marriage, rather than the sort of one night stand type thing.
Yeah, it's just funny we said that, because I sort of, I agree with you, but actually, I do like to play around.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Well,
so
it's yeah. I mean, but yeah, there's a balance there, isn't there?
yeah.
So,
Well, I know, I feel, yeah, I get what you mean though.
but you
But
know
yeah,
what? Yeah, I
totally.
mean,
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
it
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
does. That could sound really traditional and overly conservative,
Yeah.
but I think if you really want to get somewhere with your, I mean, let's just say your body for the rest of your life, you're in a relationship with your body for the rest of your life, whether you like it or not, um, and you can approach that as if you were married to your body for a long time, and how would you work in that kind of relationship container?
Maybe as you were saying there, it sort of, I noticed that maybe what we have to do when we start initially wanting to practice with the body is that we have to wake up to that relationship. And in any relationship, we have to think about what our responsibilities are. So we could talk about myself, my body, and the relational space that exists between. And in that relational space, I might put in my practice. So I might put in my weights, or I might put in my keyed, or I might put in my running. In the relational space, that becomes the object in which I can deepen my relationship to my body. But I have to awaken to that. And I think in the early stages of me working with the body, I wasn't awake to that relationship.
Mm.
And so for me, I think that's becomes really important. If I would suggest to anybody starting off, is waking up to the relationship of your body, and then start to, in some way, it's almost like tantric, really. It's about worshipping the body, and by
Yeah.
asking the body what it needs and what it wants, and also to think about the fact that it's not just the exercise. We haven't spoken about it, but I did a lot of breathing. I've done all sorts of different sorts of breathing practices to get the breath into the body. It's not just about physically pushing oneself. It's about getting the breath into the body. It's about slowing the heart rate.
Yeah. Well, anyone that does any type of physical work who is experienced, and they've done it for a long time, they do tend to start talking about the breath a lot more, whether it's strength training or
Mm, mm, mm,
running,
mm,
yoga. It's
mm.
in a way, it's almost like focusing on in the early stages, you're learning the actual form of the activity is taking up so much mental processing power. You can't focus on your breathing at the same time, because it's just too much. But once the other stuff becomes automated a bit, you can then sort of bring your attention to the more subtle things like breathing.
But one might reverse that slightly, because in running, I think running has to start with the breathing. I think that particularly the way in which I do it has to. Okay, it's interesting. I've just noticed I've said something different to what I was thinking in my head. But I think when I did the running coaching, the important thing was to ensure that people were breathing properly,
Yeah.
because there is a. If we get caught up in just doing the technique, we forget that breathing is part of the technique. And I once remember, it's a story that popped in. I once remember I was training to go into a competition in the 80s, a bodybuilding competition, and I was training with a guy who, when he breathed, when he did his weights, he had this incredibly beautiful way of breathing, but he never made a noise. And I used to go to a gym that was a proper bodybuilding gym, so he'd be grunting and groaning and screaming and shouting. He never made a noise. He was just really quiet. But he was shifting a lot of every weight. And I said to him, why do you not grunt? You don't grunt like everybody else. And he said, I don't grunt because I'm saving my breath.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
You know?
Yeah. That's
And he wasn't a spiritual bloke. He just knew instinctively that if he wanted to move a weight, he needed to get the air into his body. He needed to get power into his body to push it, and grunting and groaning lost him that energy, leaked out of him. And I think that from a perspective of working with the body, I think one starts with the breathing, so that the technique then can be built on the underlaboring of good breathing.
yeah, that's good advice. So shifting our attention now to some heart practices. By heart, I'm sort of talking about psychotherapy, relationship work, those kind of things.
Oh heavens!
Yeah, I'm here.
We're in the jungle now.
Yeah, if we could
Really
sort
are.
of rewind the tape back again,
Oh dear gosh!
when did that kind of awakening thing happen for you?
It's funny. I've been thinking about this, and I wanted to go back as far as I could. When I was a child, we had a next door neighbour who, one afternoon, he was sitting on the garden wall. He was reading a book, and I went, and he was a good neighbour, and he was well known by everybody around and things. And I went to ask him what book he was reading, and he's reading a book about out of body experiences. And I looked at this book, and I became fascinated by the notion of being out of the body. It was really early childhood. And my parents had become, as they became more and more religious, my father was very good about allowing us to read things that were anti-Christian. He always believed, he used to say that you should know your enemy. And I read a lot of witchcraft books. I also read a lot of Taoist books. And I really began very early on to really get this sense of an inner landscape that in some way was creating a sense of me. And it's always been there, and I've been fascinated by it, the idea of the inner landscape that represents me. And when I started training as an actor, I've really struggled a lot trying to break free of that northern working class structure in a cosmopolitan place. And I started doing some therapeutic work there about just developing the notion of what it means to be confident. And then I noticed that an actor becomes somebody else, and that there's something in the notion of an actor becoming somebody else that must mean that there's some techniques that one can use, therapeutically speaking, to get to know yourself better. And it's what stopped me acting, that I began to become really interested. Initially, I was fascinated by cognitive behavior therapy and the notion of repositioning thoughts to see the world differently. And I did a lot of training in cognitive behavior therapy. I went to university and did some teacher training in it. I worked for about 10 years working with people who were, the term was, this called third sector or disadvantaged people, it was the old term, but it was trying to help people gain more traction on their personal value. And I think I just became fascinated by what my personal value was and my depth into my personal value. And then I then got the opportunity to train as a drama therapist. And that's where I get into the real deep heart of my own particular journey, that it wasn't pleasant. I spent 3 years crying. My drama therapy training was predominantly in ritualistic theatre, which came from but we go back to things like Grotowski and Peter Brook there, and it was very much embodied work. So there was a lot of physical work, and there was a lot of it's quite Jungian in nature. So we did a lot of things like Paul Rebel's Hero's Journey. We did a lot of Gabrielle Roth five rhythms dancing. We did a lot of shadow work. We did a lot of personal drama based on our shadow work. And I basically spent 3 years wandering around my shadow.
Yeah.
Really getting to know the darker side of myself. And also, of course, in getting to know the darker side of yourself, there's the lighter side of yourself as well. All those things that are repressed about myself. And it wasn't pleasant. I can't for a minute suggest any shadow work is ever pleasant.
Well, how I just wanted to ask, how were you brought into contact with those shadow elements? Because quite often the shadow is an unconscious part of ourselves, and we can't necessarily access that through our own effort. And we need, well, that's why I've been working. You've been a psychotherapist helping me access my own shadow in a way that I can't do it myself. How did that happen for you?
Um, so the starting point is to find a practice that removes barrier. And in my training, so Grotowski, the Polish theatre out Grotowski, had these set of exercises called the exercises plastis. Plastis, yeah. There's another one as well, but I can't quite remember what that one is. But basically, he wanted to train his actors to remove their ego, and the exercises are done very intensely over a long period of time to the point at which you exhaust yourself. And as part of the training, we did a weekend of the exercises, and we basically just exercised for 48 hours, which is what Grotowski did. And I broke down, literally. I ended up on the floor in absolute tears because I couldn't do any more. At that point, Grotowski's notion is the ego just disappears, and what you're left with is you no longer have any resilience to tolerate repression, and it all comes flooding through.
I've noticed when I'm feeling tired, all the things that I normally push away, the nastier sides of my personality, start to come forwards. So I know exactly what you're saying, and that's just normal tiredness. That's not after 48 hours
No, it's just,
dancing around.
but it's the same thing that if Wilbur talks about the idea that as you're as you're climbing up the ladder in a way, and some of that energy is always pushed. You're using some energy to constantly keep that repression lid on yourself. That we don't necessarily have all that energy to do something, because if we always have to have a bit of energy left to keep that repression barrier down, if we become tired, that repression barrier can lift. So we can become very angry if we don't deal with our anger, or we can be very depressed if we don't deal with the sense of depression. It's what's really important for me is to spend that time in that space. And I know I use the word shadow, but it's a difficult thing because I don't really think it's a shadow as such. It's just there are things that are part of me that I may have stopped looking at, and I can only see them from their shadow, and I want to look at them. And therefore I have to turn round and I have to meet them. And Paul Rebel has some really interesting things. So active imagination is a particularly good way. There's a technique where you can, through an active imagination, you can walk into your shadow and meet your shadow content. The Gestalts, the empty chair, for example, is a useful shadow tool because you can put aspects of your shadow on the chair and you can talk to them and you can have dialogues with them. Mask work is a brilliant shadow exercise. I remember doing some incredible, powerful mask work where we went through a process of going into the shadow, seeing aspects of our shadow, and then coming out and making masks of them and wearing them. I recall one event where we had a demon dance where we all put our shadow masks on and we allowed our shadow out. So it's a frightening thing. It's not easy.
So it reminds me of sort of modern version of a lot of tribal rituals involving masks of different taboo characters, maybe, that, you know, only come out at certain times.
Well, but again, I think that's primarily because I trained in ritualistic drama therapy.
Oh yeah.
So what happens is that it was incredibly ritualistic. So the whole thing was a very ritualistic thing. What it did for me is it made me notice when when I may be experiencing a shadow moment, and it also gave me techniques to be able to speak to shadow moments. So sometimes, it's interesting. I used to find that what I could do is go on the treadmill and because the treadmill's a safe place, and I didn't have to think about where I was running. I could get on the treadmill and I could shadow run on the treadmill, which is that I would allow a shadow aspect of myself to inhabit my body and take over the running.
Wow.
So I could do things like resentment. It's very good. Quite running with it. So just allow resentment to be, let resentment run, or let anger run, let fear run, let the murderer run. It's quite good because the treadmill's safe, really.
Yeah.
But because I have that drama background, so I have the acting thing, and then the therapy thing on top of that means that I could allow these things to be embodied.
Hmm.
And that's quite funny. I don't know what it looks like in a gym when I'm running with the
Yeah.
So and because my work primarily is in supporting other people, exploring the regions of themselves that are there, but they don't. It's like the road less travelled, if you will. That they're not travelling them. I spend a lot of time thinking about it. I spend a lot of time reading about it. I spend a lot of time noticing it.
Yeah.
So it becomes quite a powerful aspect of my life now.
And you started working with clients online in about 2008. How did that compare to what you'd done before in terms of working with people? You know, you were working with people in person a lot, and then you kind of transitioned to doing a lot of online work. What is there anything of note to mention about that?
I think that the transit. I mean, it's interesting. I think in a way I didn't see a transition, because when the thing that's missing, and I think maybe one of the reasons why I took up the running coaching, is that I don't that I'm. It's not often that I work directly embodied with people, and I really enjoy doing that. I enjoy the sort of body work, and I did a lot of reading and training in Reiki and muscle arm and things, and biodynamics work. So that's and doing sort of breathing work. So that I miss doing that because I really enjoy doing that. But I think somebody once asked me the same thing, and I said, well, when we listen to a radio play, the drama takes place in our heads. The acting, we just hear voices, we create the landscape. And going online was just about going into the inner landscape and not being able to build the sets or think about how the body works. It was much more about really focusing on the inner landscape and asking questions about what was going on in the inner landscape. So it became much more instead of being directly engaged with the actor and training the actor, what I began to do is become the director supporting the actor in the performance. And it's also fair to say that I trained to be an actor because I wanted to be a director.
Right.
So it's very much about it's investigating, well, what might be stopping somebody acting in this way, what might somebody stop them behaving this way. So it's still in some way taking that technique of acting, but shifting it into, rather than the external on stage aspect, it's more about the internal landscape of the individual in their own drama.
Yeah.
So I didn't really see much of a shift.
I, you know, around 2007, around that time for me, I realized I wanted to enter into a psychotherapeutic relationship, because psychotherapy it's been something I've been fascinated with for a long time. I even did a psychology degree for a while, but I didn't actually enjoy it and stopped halfway through. But it is always something I've been interested in, but I'd never actually done psychotherapy on a long-term basis, because I live in quite a remote area, and I kind of felt like the pool of psychotherapists in my area was a bit small, probably for the more niche types of stuff I wanted to work with. I was probably unnecessarily narrow-minded there, but it was kind of easier for me to get online and find exactly the person I wanted to work with, which was you. But we live, I mean, it's like it'd be a 4-hour drive from my house to yours. So, you know, that makes it very difficult. Whereas to do it via the internet means, you know, it's very easy to make that happen, and it takes quite a lot of the cost down, because you're not having to rent a premises and that kind of thing. So, you know, one of the two of the barriers I've noticed with people who want to do psychotherapy is the cost, and then also the people they really want to work with may not be in their area, and that the internet kind of helps out with on both of those fronts.
Yes, it does, because it makes it much more accessible. And I think the psychodynamic aspect, or even the heart aspect of it all, is that, as you know, it goes back to that Marxist notion of free development, which is a condition of free development, or not taking enlightenment, or enlightened. It seems to me that I have this interest in how human beings are, and I became fascinated about how I am as a human being. I learned lots of techniques. What I wanted to do is I wanted to share those things with as many people as possible, but also at the same time make it as accessible to the people as possible. And I didn't want to pursue that normalized structure of, you're with somebody for you see somebody twice a week or once a week, and you do it for years and years and years. For me, it was more about, let's see if we can create a set of ways of approaching something that you may be able to keep working with to enhance your understanding of yourself. And from a business perspective, it's mad, because I have there are lots and lots of people that I speak with, but I may only ever speak with somebody for 4 or 6 times. But that 4 or 6 times becomes incredibly important for them to get a sense that they have it within themselves to be able to manage.
Yeah.
And what's important for me, I think, in the sort of psychotherapeutic space, or in that dimension, is it's about managing. It's not about happiness or enlightenment. It's about learning to manage the complexities of the world. And in managing the complexity of the world, noticing that there's more of the world that you can manage. And that's, for me, it's always been the case.
Well, it makes you think that a lot of people that one might call enlightened on the sort of spiritual side of things are very poor at managing the complexities of life. You know, and in fact, they actually have people dealing with all of that stuff for them. You know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love Adidar to bits, but I won't want to be with him.
Yeah.
I think, and I guess that, I mean, I guess that in a sense moves into that spiritual dimension of what I do,
Yeah.
which
Well,
is,
yeah.
I mean, if you're right going there,
Yeah. Let's do it.
it always, I mean, from the spiritual dimension, so we have the out-of-body experience, and then we have the whole notion of Taoism, and the fact that my parents have spent the most of the 70s been incredibly religious and very Pentecostal.
Oh, wait, sorry, before we just gloss over that outer body stuff, did you actually have any success with having outer body experience?
I don't know. This is really interesting because as a child, I suffered from panic attacks, and I used to lie in bed, and the room would lose it. I can't quite describe it. The room would lose its stability, and it would feel like it was sort of rushing towards me. At the same time, I felt that I wasn't necessarily anchored in where I was, and I had these experiences for what felt like many years. And as a child, they terrified me. And I think that at that point, that whole notion, I used to lie in bed as a child, breathing and looking up at the ceiling and imagine myself looking back at myself, because that's what the book did. In the book, that's what they did. They were sort of astral plane traveling, really. And I spent many years just looking at the ceiling, breathing, trying to see myself looking at myself. And I used to wander around, and I used to see if I could. I'm giggling really because it's right silly. I used to, as a child, used to wander around, imagining that I could project myself into the consciousness of another being and see the world through their eyes.
Oh God,
So I'd really,
I used to do a lot of that kind of
yeah,
fantasizing.
yeah.
I also used to fantasize about what would it be like if you could simultaneously experience every species simultaneously, and then come out of that experience.
Yeah. But it was really, I mean, but so I'd sort of, what would happen, of course, is that I would become slightly, I'd start moving to slight psychosis in a way, because as a child, instead of developing a core identity, which is what you should have been doing as children, what I was doing is trying to be everybody else's core identity.
Yeah.
And so, and I didn't, as a child, I didn't speak until I was 3 years old. So it's quite clear that there was something about wanting to maintain that inner world for as long as possible. And then when I began to manifest in the relative realm, I wanted to be somewhere else. And it's always been, that's a theme that runs through my entire life. I always want to be somewhere else, and I'm always interested in what's over there or what makes that thing work. That's a fascination of mine. But so spirituality becomes it becomes a thing that's not important in my family. It's just in the family. So we go to church. My parents have Bible readings. I've been baptized in the Holy Spirit. In a pool, in fire, in Butlins. I've been,
Wow.
it's literally. I mean, and that was, I think, it was about 14 or 15 when that happened. So all our holidays were evangelical holidays. We went to Butlins holiday camps at the last 2 weeks of each season, where it was just given over to evangelists. As a child, I was taken to see Billy Graham. I'd been intense listening to preachers. So for a long period of my developmental structure as a child, spirituality just became the thing that you did. Religion, but not really religion. It was more about the Pentecostal thing. Is very much about praising the Lord, noticing the Lord, and the out of body experience of the fainting, the talking in tongues, it all fascinated me. It was great. So it's always been there within me, but it's never been. It was never stabilized into a particular pattern. So I never really went off and sort of studied it. And I had friends who were Buddhist and I read Buddhist stuff, but I was never really interested in Buddhism. And I like Taoism. And when I came to London, I really became incredibly fascinated by Taoism and started to think about going to a Taoist temple. There used to be a Taoist temple in Seoul, and I wanted to go and visit there. And I really began to think about becoming a Taoist monk because the whole notion of the spiritual idea just fascinated me. I just thought it was incredible because it really sat well with my idea of not being located in myself.
Yeah.
It also had a notion. I was also fascinated by alchemy as well, and the Taoists had a whole alchemical process as well. So that's another reason, sort of academic reason why. So my spirituality has always been there, and it's been expressed by things like the way in which I approach the yoga, the way in which I approached acting. In acting, I became much more interested in what I would now call non-duality, or acting from the non-dual, and what that would look like. But I had never ever formalized it. It was just primarily because it was just something I did. When integral theory and integral transformative practice comes on, of course, there becomes a much more formalized way of doing, or what we might talk about, practices. So we talk about meditation. So I don't like sitting in a posture. I've always found it quite uncomfortable. So for me, meditation was much more about being single focused on breathing, or single focused on running, or single focused on the exercise. It again, it just became something that I did. But I had a major problem with the whole notion of spirituality, which was this thing that you had to try and attain, this non-dual space that you had to try and attain. And I used to get really annoyed at, is it Sailor Bob? Sweet Sailor Bob, think, why can't I have that experience? Why can't I have that Satori experience? Why can't I do it? Why can't? And I used to get really annoyed. I'd be breathing, I'd be meditating. I think, why can't I have this non-dual one? Why can't I awaken? And one day I just thought, maybe you're already awake. Maybe that's it. Maybe you're just already awake.
I think that's a very common story that that this kind of spirit, enlightenment, spiritual beingness is so often set up as an external goal. And I'm thinking of the Zen ox herding pictures, which is a series of pictures which depict the path of meditation. And you start out kind of seeing the ox, which is the Zen, the enlightenment, and then you start sort of taming it and then riding it, and then you all go off into the mountains and everything turns into formlessness, and then it kind of ends up with this big fat happy guy coming into the town with a bag full of sweets giving out to the children. And some people in some religious traditions, the spirituality is always something which is outside of yourself, which you're sort of moving towards, but it's like on the ever receding horizon. You never quite get there. And one of for me, when I came across Ken Wilber's integral theory, and of course, he's not the only one who's done this integral stuff, lots of others, but one of the things which really changed for me was the notion, this sort of conceptual framework around the first person, second person, and third person dimensions of spirituality. And for people listening who that might sound a bit abstract, the first person is your experience, second person is in relationship to another person, and then the third person experience is more of a sort of objective out there in the world, with all of the other forces in the world interacting with it. And so I'd had this kind of third person and second person thing going on with my spirituality, but the missing piece was my own direct experience and seeing and noticing the sort of what you might call transpersonal aspects of my own experience as it is. So for me, that was a big moment. I'm just sharing that because what you were saying kind of reminded me of that.
Well, no, I think it's true. That I think that it is that it's the notion that what I began to question is, if I'm a spiritual being, then the notion of spirit exists within me. It's not something that I'm trying to reach out for. And also, it may not be this sort of shifting consciousness that all of a sudden I can see the network nature that's in nature. It may not be that kind of thing. It may just be that what it is, I mean, I think it's the Wilbur for me really sums up when he said it's the simple sense of being. It's just feeling a being. And in that real deep sense of being, I can feel a heartbeat, and it's not my heartbeat. It's some other heartbeat. I know my heartbeat because I've spent time listening to it when I've been running. But that spirituality for me, or that spiritual dimension in sort of integral practices, is about becoming more aware of that heartbeat and then saying, how do I keep that heartbeat strong? What do I do to keep that heartbeat strong? But it's not my heartbeat, it's the heartbeat of spirit. And what I began to realize is that spirit is everywhere. So then I have a responsibility to keep that heartbeat strong. And it might be that it's a commune thing. I do it in my local community, or I do it with the world, but it's the sense in which I have a responsibility to keep that heartbeat strong. So then say to myself, well, what's my way? How can I take on that responsibility? So the work I do is about helping other people hear that heartbeat and keep it strong. And I think there is a deep, if I did a therapy session on myself, I'd say there's a deep reason for that, which is, as a child, I was so enmeshed in religious doctrine of a particular creed that when it came to being spiritual, I had to reject them all. So I went off and I've done Zen retreats, and I've done all the tabagathatas or whatever, and I've just prostrated myself, and I've done something thinking, it's not for me, mate. I'm not bowing down to that piece of plaster, because that's not spirituality for me. That's, for me, spirituality doesn't need a grand ritual of dressing. Spirituality just needs to hear that heartbeat.
So you were talking of the heartbeat. That might sound a bit abstract to people. Can you unpack that concept a little bit? I mean, I'm asking you to express the ineffable.
Yeah. Oh, all right, then. I'll have a go. So see if I can do it. Let me see. How might I do it? I've got it. It just popped in. So I see if I can get this. I think no. One of the things that speaking to people in my practice, in the sense of my work, at the early stages of lockdown, people were overwhelmed by the possibility of space, not overwhelmed in the sense of a negative, but all of a sudden chattering had stopped. You couldn't get coffee, you couldn't get your flour, all those things that we expected we could normally get. We couldn't go to the pub and things. And so many people I spoke to were, this is really nice. Okay, so there are things that we can't do. But suddenly removing all of those things, all of those contractions of a relative realm, gave people the opportunity to go, this is really nice. There's a stillness there. And what they could speak about is really seeing things, really noticing things, really being awake to things, because they weren't rushing around. And what's been really interesting is that as I spoke to people now, and we're sort of in coming out of lockdown, so many people I'm speaking to are really overwhelmed now. It's become a really difficult space to be in. That really what they're doing now is saying, I want congestion now. I want conflict. I want something to take me away from this stillness. Now, if I sit really still now, my hearing expands and I can hear more. So it seemed to me that hearing more of what's there is I'm in a room now where if I really go still, I can hear the wind blowing through the trees in the park across the way, because there's nothing else. There's no noise around it. It's just the wind. And so when I talk about this sort of heartbeat, it's about removing all the things that we construct around ourselves to make ourselves feel okay, and noticing that actually we're okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's that's the okay. And I am aware that I am making a massive generalization, because there are people that for many, many reasons are not okay. And I get that. And I get that there are socialist, the political, there are ideological things that have caused people to really not be okay. But at the heart of every human being is the notion that they're okay. And it seems to me that when we started to really notice that we were okay, we started to rebel against it.
Yeah, that's it. Humans are so fickle, you know. It's like, yeah, you kind of you pretend that you want to feel okay with all the time with everything, and then when you're given the opportunity, you're like, no, I'm not doing that.
No, I'm not
But
gonna do that.
just thinking about, you're saying people in difficult life circumstances not being okay. There have been many, many examples of people that have been in the most horrendous life circumstances, concentration camps, prison, tortured, and abusive relationships and that, but who have nonetheless somehow managed to access that deep level of being that is okay, even whilst living in hell. That those kind of stories are part of popular culture. Even, I'm thinking of some of the stories that came out of the Nazi concentration camps and that. So it's not, life circumstances make this kind of thing very difficult, but not impossible.
Well, isn't it? It's the sort of man's search for meaning. The idea that what from the spiritual dimension, we might have to say, well, if we were to, what's the practice of the spiritual dimension? And for me, it's the practice of love, and it's the practice of recognizing that love is an energy that we've capitalized into something that we spend. And I think that if I think about anything that's wrong with the whole capitalist notion of the world, is that it turned love into something that we can make profit from. And I think that is absolutely, for me, it's the worst thing that human beings ever did, is decided that they would turn love into capital. And it's brought so much pain and anguish to people who have been caught up in being a commodity of that love.
Yeah.
So
That, I think you can see a reflection of that in the way a truly loving gesture, which we might call a spiritual love type of gesture, is one that doesn't expect any return on it. You know, it's a gift, an absolute gift, one way exchange. No, not exchange, just a gift. And on the other side, you've got this kind of conditional love of, I will give you some love, but I'm going to call in the favor sometime in the future, and they're quite different modes.
Well, it's when we use our power of love and we connect it to an object that we think will give us more love. So the idea of saying something like, I love profit, and therefore if I make more profit, then I'll have more love. But then I have to question the notion of, well, how am I going to make more profit? Well, I'll make more profit from the notion of producing something that can be sold, but I need to sell it at a reduced price so that I can have profit. So I know what I'll do. What I'll then do is I need energy. I need energy to make the profit, to make the product, to make the profit, so I can get more because I love profit. Well, where am I going to get that energy from? Well, if I don't have machines to do that, I have to have another form of energy source. Well, as human beings, they're my energy source. But so what I'll do is, because I love profit and because I love the things that give me profit, I will take human beings and turn them into nothing more than machines. I will dehumanize them for the very nature of my profit, and I'll call it love. I love profit. Look at my big house. I love my big house. But that big house was built on the structure of dehumanizing human beings. And for me, that's the tragedy of human beings, is they took something that was pure, that was there for us to create contingency with each other, to meet each other, to see each other as another human being, and it turned it into something that caused people immense suffering. And it's just, I find it absolutely, I don't know. Well, I do know. It's soul destroying. And for me, that's the worst thing that human beings can do with their inadequate understanding of love, is to destroy souls of people.
Yeah. That's really really powerful, and I think, you've kind of defined the abstraction in a way that I can relate to, as it is all about love, but there's different types of love, and it's being able to discern what we might call authentic love from and a generative love, as compared with a type of love, this kind of twisted love, which is ultimately destructive.
I can, for me, I understand that idea of creating objects of love, but then for me, spirituality is about love, and it's about the energetic nature of love, and then it's about, what do I want to do with that love? How might I want that love to show up, or how might I want to embody that love? So if my spiritual practice is to make sure that I don't create an object for my love that then says that what I'm doing is I'm giving parental love. I don't think such a thing as parental love. I actually don't think there's such a thing as generative love. I don't think there's such a thing as twisted love. I think it's just love, that we then create a notion of what kind of love it is. There isn't any kind of love. There's just love, for me. And it's about finding a space where it's within myself, and then being really careful and respectful of that, and ensuring that when it's shared with other people, it's shared with other people so that they can see that they have it within themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I love it. But so yeah, no, that's really profound. It's a very simple definition of spiritual practice or spirituality, and extremely pithy. I think it's
Oh,
all contained in there.
that's quite exciting. Nobody's ever called me pithy before.
Pithy. So
Brilliant.
one thing we haven't touched on quite is how our minds come into this constellation of our lives. And one of my things that makes me a bit grumpy is the anti-intellectualism that is part of so much spirituality and self-help and that. And I understand where that's come from, because it's so much of what we need to do as a species is get out of our heads a bit more and reconnect with our body and emotions and spiritual beingness. So I know why why that is happening out there in the culture, but it's unnecessarily hobbling people's growth, and also if we were talking of love, it's one way of accessing love is through the intellect and the mind. So perhaps you could speak a bit about the life of your mind, your relationship with your thinking, and how that's changed over time, and if there have there been particular moments where certain theories came along that showed you new things, which took you so far, and then something else happens, and just a little bit about your journey.
Well, if we talk about mind as a processing of ideas, I didn't have a mind for a long while. I didn't particularly enjoy school, wasn't particularly good at school, and really just when I left school, I wanted to be an actor. That's all I wanted to do, and it's because I didn't function well in that sort of academic setting, and I really didn't function well, and I began to believe that I didn't function well in that academic setting for years. So for a lot of the 80s, I worked in kitchen portering, and I worked in hospitals. I used to empty laundry bags from the surgeries, which was a dreadful job. But I believed that I had a mind that was only fit for emptying laundry bags. I was doing all the bodybuilding things, but still the acting. But I believed that I believed a narrative that I'd been told that all my mind would be able to process ideas of is which sheet goes into which bin. And it wasn't until I began to think about stopping putting laundry sheets in bins. And I'd always had this idea that I wanted to do something in philosophy. And I did an open college course in a sort of introduction to philosophy. And all of a sudden I kind of thought, oh, actually, this is not difficult. This is not hard work. And from there, I then went on and did a BTEC in Performing Arts, went to drama school, and all of a sudden my mind started to function because it had suddenly been given ideas that it went, oh, I quite like this. This is interesting. And it was ideas about the nature of the world. I mean, now I will go back and say it was ideas about the nature of reality. And at that point, because I was coming into contact, again, I go back to some of my heroes, Brooke, Grotowski, Stephen Berkoff. These were people who were really thinking about the ideology for the ideas of theatre. And I thought it were great. And I really began to read a lot of theatre stuff. And many books around the theory of theatre. And I quite liked Aaron Beck with his books around cognitive behaviour therapy. So I read a lot of Aaron Beck. Then I found Jung. And Jung really sat well with all the drama training, and what Jung was providing is a sort of transpersonal nature of things. And my interest in the transpersonal, sorry, stayed with me because it was being interested in the transpersonal that actually took me to train as a drama therapist. And it was John Rowan's book on the transpersonal that I always point to being the thing that liberated me. Because it was such an easy book to read, and it was such an informative book, but it was a book that said there's this realm and there are these people that are really deeply talking about the notion of reality from the transpersonal. And he had a chapter in there about Wilbur, but it was Wilbur prior to sex, psychology, and spirituality, which I find very difficult to understand. But just as I'd done with the sort of the exercising, I suddenly found myself desperate to understand it. So I had all this history of being somebody who would work in a laundry. And all of a sudden I threw it all away and said, I want to know this, I want to understand this. And I worked really hard to understand John Rowan's stuff. And then of course, when I get to reading Wilbur stuff, I'd already done a BTEC, no, I'd done a postgraduate certificate of education at Greenwich University. So I'd already started to develop a sort of confidence in academic writing, academic thinking. With the drama therapy training, I'm writing essays and keeping journals and writing theses and things. And I'm becoming much, much more interested in Wilbur through John Rowan. And then I get to spiral dynamics. And I thought spiral dynamics was absolutely fabulous. The book's a bit hard work, it's a bit boring. But spiral dynamics really switched my brain on. Because it gave me a framework for reality that wasn't necessarily hierarchical in saying these people are like this because of their social condition, and these people. It didn't have that kind of let's put people into these category things. I love the idea of colours and that colours were in people, and then set against Wilbur's map, his quadrants map. I ploughed my way through sex, psychology, and spirituality, and I thought sex, psychology, and spirituality were brilliant. And then I'm completely switched on. And as Wilbur says, his work, I would have to say, switches you on, because when you read it, you kind of go, "Yeah, it makes sense. That I understand that. Yeah, I see that. Why didn't I see that before?" He really says it is mind active, because it starts posing questions. The brain loves questions. What we know is that the brain thinks, and if you don't give it something to think, it'll create fantasies to think about. So my brain suddenly had all these things to think about. What quadrant am I in? What level am I at? It was just fabulous, and I became so enamored by Wilbur and what he was presenting and the way he was presenting. I went off to Boulder and I met the man. I've done the training. I've trained in level 1 spiral dynamics.
Just say, some people listening to this won't know what spiral dynamics are or integral theory, and I'm not suggesting at all that we, to try and describe what's in those theories. I mean, people could go look them up and see if they find them equally powerful. So we don't need to unpack that. People could go and look it up, I think, unless there was something in particular you thought might be a quick way of summing it up.
Yeah, I think that there are ways we can see things, and what integral theory and spiral dynamics propose is that there is not just one way that we can see something. we can see something in different ways, and we might call those that, we might say that they're different theories about how we can see something. But the thing that we see is we can always see it differently. Now that's what fascinates me about integral theory and spiral dynamics, is that they were proposing that you could look at something and see it differently. You could do different ways you could see it. Well, as a child, I'm wandering around, wanting to be in everybody's heads, asking how do they see the world? And what Wilbur and spiral dynamics are saying is there are these theories that can show you how to see things in different ways. Well, it's much more complicated than that. It becomes quite overcomplicated. But what's fascinating is that they're just ways in which you can see things.
Yeah. So, yeah, 5 people. Well, let's just make it a bit simpler. Three people might be looking at the same phenomenon, whether it's a cultural phenomenon or, I mean, let's say it takes something. Well, I don't want to get too much into politics. Let's take something like, something like politics. The politics, UK politics, for example. 3 people might look at UK politics and draw completely different conclusions from it, and they are perceiving kind of different worlds. And part of what these theories enable you to do is to access the kind of spectrum of different. There are types of perception that people tend to aggregate around, the types of perspective on things, and you can slice it up as many ways as you like, but there are kind of general patterns, and once you can understand how there's across this spectrum of ways of perceiving life or anything, you become more fluid, and it relates to this thing of love, that you can. It's a very loving act to truly enter another person's perspective and see the world through their eyes.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it also it's liberating for you, because it gives you this fluidity to deal with. It kind of comes back to complexity again, that this is almost at the heart of the complexity of human life, is that there are so many different ways that people perceive the same things. And once you become a bit more proficient in understanding the variety of these perceptions, you kind of embrace this complexity that's inside ourselves and inside of all of human culture.
Well, what you do is you remove fear of the other.
Yeah.
So that if I used to describe it like a lemon. If I put a lemon on a table, somebody might see it as, they might see it for its nutrients. Somebody might see it for how it was capitalistically produced. Somebody might see it as, I reckon, they went and bought it with their partner. And somebody might see it as a wonderful recognition of nature. So they may all see it differently. What's beautiful about things like the integral philosophy, if you will, and which we can drop spiral dynamics into, is that it says these are real views. These are real ways in which we can see something. And therefore, if we then get in traction on the different ways something can be seen, and we accept that the individual is seeing it, and we understand how they're seeing it and why they're seeing it in that way, there is no conflict now. I accept their view. It's not my view, but I can give space for their view. And in giving space for their view, I expand my view by including their view. And hopefully they include my view, they expand their view. So what we're doing is we're increasing our capacity as human beings to interact with each other.
Yeah, I was thinking of the politics again. What if you are on the left or liberal progressive person politically, and so often one would write off the conservative perspective of politics, and vice versa. If you're more conservative, you might look at the lefties and just not even you just think they're just crazy. And you don't want any, to enter into the perspective of the political other is like, who wants to do that? But when you start to do it, you actually understand that people that see politics differently from you, they're on the other side of the right or left divide or whatever. There are truths that they're perceiving which you aren't from your political vantage point. And of course, it's not to say that, if you inhabit the let's just say you're on the left politically, someone asks you to try and inhabit the perspective of somebody on the right. What some of the reluctance people feel to do that is that they feel like they might get trapped in there, a bit like those fables where they say, don't eat the fruit. You go to some magic land and say, don't eat the fruit, and the person eats the fruit and then they fall asleep, they wake up and they're got donkey's ears, and they've suddenly you find you're a Republican or a conservative, how did that happen? But you can enter these perspectives, feel the truth and validity of that perspective, the things they're perceiving which you're not, which are true, and in fact things you would actually want to take away with you. So if we're thinking of the conservative view, some of the things around family values and tradition and law and order, those kind of things, they're really quite positive. But you don't have to. You can bring that with you, and you don't have to bring the things that you genuinely think are wrong with you. You can actually leave them aside. Yeah.
Well, but it's that awakening to that notion for me that you can inhabit, again, it's all about you can inhabit the space of the other person. You can really get in traction on how that other person sees something. You can take what you think is useful, you can reject, you have that freedom to do that. But what you're doing is honoring the other person's perspective. Again, sits back to the idea of the child that wants to be in the head of the other person. What I find fascinating is that what Wilbur was doing for me is he was speaking about the notion of spirituality as something that didn't necessarily need the ritualistic structure that I'd experienced as a child. He was talking, initially I had issues around his developmental ladder where he put the spiritual states on top, because that still made me feel like, I'm never going to get there because I've got to reach these higher echelons to get into causal spiritual realms. Then there was the shifting of how he mapped his views and things. But what Wilbur, for me, what really excited me is when Wilbur the Wilbur Coombs Matrix, where Wilbur said there's a developmental altitude, and then at every level of your consciousness there is this access to these states, these beautiful spiritual states. And he was sort of, for me, he was kind of saying, this is the map of it, this is what it could look like. And what I realized is that the reason why my mind didn't switch on in the 70s and 80s is because I like cartography, I like map making, I like understanding maps, I like drawing maps. I don't mean literally going out and drawing the maps of London streets. I like to map people. When I talk to people, I like to get a map of where they're going and what they're doing, and shall we walk down this road, shall we go down? That's what Wilbur brought, is thinking as mapping, but also recognizing there were some areas that I didn't know. So if I'd come across an area I didn't know, I think I'll go off and investigate that dark area, see if I can get a map of it. So he really lit me up. So I'd say that John Rowan provides a sort of starting point. Wilbur and Spiral Dynamics provide the kind of catalyst. But then we have to get to critical realism and Bashkar, and that's the point where I really began to think for thinking. I find, it's a massively complex thing, and I don't know if we really want to go into that space.
I mean, I have to confess, critical realism as not. I mean, I've not spent a lot of time with critical realism trying to understand it, but I think partly because it seems very dense and difficult to understand. I mean, and really that should be an indication that it's something I should try and spend some time to understand. I was talking to Layman Pascal the other day, and he was saying one of, a really simple practice for your mind is to read stuff that you find difficult. It's good practice.
Absolutely, it is. But I think the difficult process for me is it's the wanting. I heard Bashkar speak at a festival that had been organised by Enlighten Next, and because he was in London, very near where I live, I went along, and he was speaking about non-duality, and his talk was called "Activist for the Real," and Bashkar said something that I'd never heard anybody say before, which is he said, "Non-duality is the causal property of social cohesion." And I never heard anybody say that before. He wasn't talking about some grand spiritual satori gesture, or he wasn't speaking about going off into ashrams or spending 10 days in silent retreat. He was saying non-duality, ontologically speaking, or the sense of being, is what is necessary for human beings to interact with each other. And I kind of went, wow. Wilbur never said that. Spart Hampson say that. This is a man, a professor of philosophy, saying this is how it is. And I got so excited about what he said that I then went off to read one of his books. And I picked his book up and I thought, oh dear God, it's really hard.
Yeah.
But it inspired me so much by what he said that I began to pursue his stuff and unravel it. And I'm still unraveling it. And I've met the man, I've worked with the man, and he was, for me, if I wanted to suggest what a spiritual being is like in the gentlemanly quality of the man, it was Bashkar. Bashkar just was a gentleman, and he took time for people. He didn't need to take time for people, but if we think about that idea of practice theory consistency, he was constantly consistent. And that's what I loved the man so much, because he was consistent, because he was secure, because what he believed he could speak about, and he believed that what he wanted is a philosophy that could affect people at an everyday level. The unfortunate thing, of course, is that he was writing for an audience that were anti what he was talking about. So he had to have a very complex. He once said to me, "I have to have a complex argument because I'm arguing with people who have complex arguments."
Yeah, that makes me. It was some guy who does some business coaching stuff, and he was in a room full of very intelligent people, and he was just like saying, "I've been attacked by clever people." It's and he was obviously a very clever person himself, but he was yeah, it's like what it's like to be in that kind of environment.
Yeah. So you have to be as clever, if not cleverer, than them in a way. And so that was unfortunately the space in which Bashkar inhabited as an academic, but as a person, his philosophy impacted on his life, and that's what I find really lovely. And I also find that there was no grandiosity about him. There was no cult around him, and he was really addressing things in a way that made deep sense to me. And that began my sort of pulling away from integral theory, because I felt that integral theory more and more was just repeating the same thing over and over again, that I'd not heard it say anything new. And I'd started to become quite frustrated by it, and I'd started to become frustrated by the way in which there was this kind of almost Godhead notion of the community. And I did, again, therapeutically speaking, that's primarily because I started feeling like it was becoming a bit religious. for me, because of my experience. So
Is there are there YouTube videos of Roy Bashkar talking in a more conversational tone? I mean, is there somewhere where, you know, the people that are not the hardcore academics could encounter his work and get some kind of traction with it?
there is a website that's just been reactivated, and it's the Critical Realism Network, and there is on the critical realism, I think if you type in, I think it might be www.criticalrealismnetwork.com or something like that, but if you type in Critical Realism Network, there are a series of very simple videos of somebody talking about critical realism to introduce critical realism, and then there's an interview with Roy, which I think is about 6 minutes long, and somebody said it's the most succinct way that Bashkar has talked about his entire philosophy in 6 minutes.
Right.
And that's
Yeah,
worth looking at.
that's what I'm after. The elevator speech.
Yeah. But it's a challenge, but I think what Wilbur had done for me from perspective of mind, that he'd awakened my mind to multiple maps of reality and how to navigate these multiple maps of reality. What Bashkar was saying is what the territory looks like, and that's what I got so excited. I think that's where I started to get a little bit disillusioned by integral theory. Is that notion of the map's not the territory, but keep giving me the map. I want to know the territory. We'll expand the map. We'll have 8 zones, and we'll have 8 horizons, and we'll have a cube. No, stop giving me maps. I want territory. And Bashkar was talking about the territory. What does the world look like?
Yeah, that was a similar experience for me. I kind of, once I'd got the map thing with the integral theory, I wanted to know what was real life like lived this way, and who was doing it. What were the companies that were doing this, and what were the communities that were doing? Who were the people? What would I become if I put this into practice? So, Ken gives you this map, which is incredible, and then it's up to everybody else to fit it in, the details in, with their own lives. And so the quest for me became connecting with people who were actually doing this work, building personal relationships with them, and making it real. And what you're saying is familiar, that of just going over the map over and over again. And once you've heard it, for 1,000 times, it's like, okay, so I'm just going to stop listening to the map now, or think I'm just going to, get down in the weeds a bit.
I think for me, this is just a thing, but I think for me, when I read his last book, I can't remember what it's called now. I just thought,
Religion of Tomorrow.
Religion of Tomorrow. So, what if you can't put it in the book? Don't put in a footnote.
Right. Yeah.
Stop it. And I think that was the thing I was getting, is that for me, practices of the mind are giving my mind something that it becomes so interested in that it becomes obsessed in thinking about it. So I know that my mind is a thinking thing. I know that if I give it something to do, it will think it. So rather than give it negative things to think about, why don't I look at a book that I'm uncertain about, and why don't I pursue it and give my mind something to think about? And so it's interesting to go back to the notion of the sort of it's not the dumbing down so much as it's the taking concepts and creating the way in which the concept is put forward without getting too academic. So I've just read a book on the orgasmic, living the orgasmic life, which is a women's book on tantric sex, but it's done in a very Californian way. It's a good book, and it's an easy book to read. And as I was reading through it, and I thought it's a good book, some really interesting things. There's some things I think was a bit dumbing down that, but what it does is it offers the gateway to really investigating more of this stuff, and that's always my starting point. I'll always read a sort of a self-help book first of all. I think, oh, I don't want to go and read the academic papers on this particular theoretical approach, but there's a self-help book that I can read, that's Pepsi-Colaed it a bit, but it's a really useful tool because people want to put by. I'll go and read that, and then afterwards think, yeah, I really enjoyed that. Now I want to go and find out more about it. So I've
Yeah,
always
it's
done
kind
that.
of laddering up or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this useful thing, and maybe that's if I was to say what would be a mind practice, I would say laddering up. The if there are things, I mean, that's what with the Order of Natural Necessity, which is the book that I edited from some talks that I did with Roy in 2014. The notion of that book was to try and create that idea of laddering, that it was to present critical realism in a way that was kind of accessible to many people, that would give them enough grounding in his theory to want to say, now I think I'll take on a more challenging book. So I think there's a real space for those kind of front door books, really.
Yeah.
I think there's too many, but I think we have to talk about the fact that you do them because they sell well and all that sort of thing.
We've nearly done 2 hours, which is amazing,
Wow.
and I've absolutely loved this conversation. It's been brilliant, and it's
Oh,
been very interesting doing it with the video off. I think that saved the audio quality. The audio
yeah.
quality of the call's been good, but it's interesting how not having the video there really changes the nature of the conversation. It's been quite interesting for me to notice that. But this will be, I think, this is primarily a podcast, an audio thing, but I will be putting on YouTube. But I'll probably put some cool visuals up on YouTube while people listen to it. So before you say where people can find out more about your work or things you care about, is there any last thing you feel ought to be said?
Ought to be said.
Not ought to be said. Do you want to say anything? Anything? Is love moving you to say anything else?
I feel like I should say something. Like what you feels like you're saying to me is that we've done the interview now. Have you got any questions to ask? No, I don't think I have. I can hear lots of voices in my head chattering and saying, "Oh, let me say something," and I'm sure I'll go away and think of something. No, right now, when I listen to all the voices, there's nothing really clamoring to say anything. There's nobody saying I ought to have space.
Yeah, it's been a very comprehensive conversation. It's been amazing, and it's so for me personally, it's been wonderful to hear more about your life, because even though I've known you for 12 or 13 years, and of course I know stuff about you, about your life, we've met in person quite a few times as well. But there's so much I've learned about you today. It's been really cool, and I think you've got so much to share with people through. You've been doing this stuff for a long time.
It has been very difficult, actually. It's been a difficult 2 hours because I'm not used to talking about myself. I'm used to asking people questions about themselves. So it's been really challenging.
Well, you've done great. And I hardly needed to ask any questions.
I'm pleased about that.
Yeah. So if people want to find out more about your work or anything you particularly care about, what would you point out?
I have a website, and the website is it's www.garyhawke.org, and that's sort of it's a professional website in that it sort of details my professional things that I do, like what do I do to earn my money? And also there's lots of things about me rambling about things that have suddenly angered me or frustrated me or I wanted to speak about. So there's lots of me right there. And also there are some testimonials and reviews of things that I've done. So it's a good place. If people wanted to get a sense of what I am, that's a good place to go to, because sometimes it can be a bit theory heavy, and sometimes I can get a bit sort of over preachery, but that's the place to go to know more about me.
Cool. And I mean, I'll just do a testimonial to say that it's been such a powerful thing working with you all these years, and you know, I can plan to do many more, as much as you can tolerate. And
I've got very high tolerance.
Okay. But it's you've been an amazing psychotherapist, and
Thank you.
what made me seek you out initially was that you brought this great breadth to it of this whole, you know, if we were to break it up into body, heart, mind, spirit, you know, you bring all of that to it. It's not just your kind of classic talk therapy. It's been a really transformative thing for me, and I'm so grateful for it. And so I get you, for what it's worth, my recommendation is there.
But for what it's worth, is that it's worth a lot.
Yeah, well, it certainly has been for me.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for your generosity in giving this time to talk.
Even though it's been a challenge, I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Cool. I will no doubt speak to you soon. And who knows, might get people on as repeat guests on the podcast.
Oh, exciting.
Yeah. All right. Lots of love, Gary.
All right, you take care of yourself.
Yeah. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.